Professor Deardorff.
Thank you. Is this about the right volume? A little closer then? Okay. We could have the first slide just to get the picture on the screen here. My talk is about the Meier case. It just refuses to go away because there is so much good photographic evidence, daytime photos of high quality. The case is still unequaled by any other contactee case in terms of the number of opportunities the contactee has had to take good photographs, about 17 different times in the Swiss area to the east and southeast of Zurich there in 1975 and 76 and on into the 1980s. Well, this picture here comes from a photograph album or book put out by Lee and Britt Elders. The first volume was under the supervision of Wendell Stevens. Some of the photos I'll be showing here come from there. Others come from Switzerland themselves, the Meier's UFO support group that at least up to a couple of years ago was selling his photos, copies and copies of his photos for at price. And a few others of my slides I'll be showing come from Wendell Stevens himself. This photo I got acquainted with in around 1980 when I got that volume 1 from Lee and Britt Elders. I'd sort of gotten interested in ufology in the late 1970s and happened to be on their mailing list of notifications from Genesis 3 of what they had, and took a chance and ordered this, and the photos in there looked very realistic to me, but I didn't really do anything more about it until 1983, and their second volume came out, giving ever more supportive evidence that the case could be no hoax. Then I really began to wonder, why hasn't science caught on to this? I was still an active scientist at that time. So I was wondering, maybe the population doesn't know about it, but why shouldn't science at least know about it? And then I learned that even that ufologists have known about it for a long time, but there's a lot of reasons why the leading ufologists of most of the groups were debunking the case ever more heavily in the 1980s. In 1984, I came upon this document that Wendell Stevens mentioned, the Talmud of Jmmanuel, and realized that there's much more to the Meier case than just a whole slew of photographs that he was allowed to take on 17 different occasions in Switzerland there. But a very important document, unless it were a hoax. So I've been spending the last 12 years turning myself into an independent New Testament gospel scholar just to check out the reality of this document, the Talmud of Jmmanuel. And needless to say, I find all kinds of reasons why it's no hoax and no reasons why it is a hoax. So that's why I'm talking about it here today. But I feel that the supportive evidence for the Meier case of its photos and its movie films and its metal samples and the soundtracks he gathered on tape and the secondary witnesses, all that indicates the reality of the case tends to support the reality of the Talmud of Jmmanuel. But the Talmud of Jmmanuel can be studied in its own right as a document that was a forerunner to one of the Gospels, namely the Gospel of Matthew, not the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew. And if it's found to be genuine, as best you can tell without having the originals, I'll go into that later, then that tends to support the whole reality of Meier's experiences all the more. This is just the one of the front pages of the 1992 version of the Talmud of Jmmanuel, which we'll get to pretty soon. Meier has always insisted that the German version, which was the translation that the old Aramaic was made into, that's on the left here, that German version be published along with the English version. So this has, it came out in 1992, has both versions page after page printed there. It cost twice as much for the publisher to have to put it out, but Wildfire Press was nevertheless willing to do this. there's been since a 1996 version come out. I do have some flyers on my little table up on the third floor in the book room that can tell you if you want to order one of the Talmud of Jmmanuel and read it. That's where to go to look for that. Well, let's first now look at more of the evidence that supports the Meier case. Because of certain recent debunkings in the last year or two it's received, I think it's worthwhile going over a little bit of the evidence once more. Oops, sorry, that one is upside down, but it's the same one you saw again. Same one you saw before. It should be familiar to you because we saw it Monday night at the film festival, those of us who were here, and there's another copy of it on the wall over there that came from one of Wendell Stevens' calendars. And it's furthermore on the paperback cover to the book on the Meier case put out by Wendell Stevens himself in 1982 called UFO Contact from the Pleiades Preliminary Investigation Report. And that's the Bible, you might say, for the Meier case. That is now left and right reversed, but that's okay. Well, Wendell Stevens back in 1977 got started on this case, and in 1978 he managed to get, with Meier's permission, first-hand direct copies of 40 of Meier's original film of color photos, color slides, 40 internegatives with which to examine the reality of the photographic evidence. And then soon after he obtained another dozen positive-to-positive prints. So this was one of the photos he was able to obtain and study it very intensively, mainly with the help of Jim Dilatosa. And on this, the original of this was high enough quality that they could tell that this limb here actually crossed over in front of the far edge of the craft. But on further copies of copies, like this one taken from a book, you can't really tell that because the underside of the craft is in the shade and it's dark, and the tree on this side especially is in the shade, and you can't tell the contrast between the two. I might mention that the chief debunker of the last year is Kel Korff. In his book, he claims that the craft is on the front side of the tree and therefore is a model up close to the camera. Well, to come to that conclusion, he did some sort of a so-called enhancement to the photo he had. The photo he had was many generations removed from Meier's original, because he had to get it from Meier's group the same way any of the rest of us do, by asking for a copy and paying $5 or so for it. And you just get then one of the remaining copies that was left, and whenever they run out of a particular series of photos, they make more copies from the last one that's left, and that's been going on since 1978 or so. So what he had to work with was very poor quality to start from, and very difficult to make any conclusions on what branch did or did not go in front of the underside of the craft. But nevertheless, he reversed positive and negative in his so-called enhancement procedure so that the underside of the craft looked light instead of dark, and then he managed to get the tree limbs to have dark edges on them, and the bottom of the craft to have dark line along there. Then when you didn't see any branches going in front of the craft, dark branches going in front of the light underside of the craft, he took that to mean that it had to be a model in front of the tree, close to the camera. So that is a dirty pool, I would say, in terms of trying to get the naive reader to come to the same conclusion that you want them to come to. Well, where do you think the sun is in this photograph? Does it... these rays don't show up very well, but you can see two hints of golden rays coming down here. So the first guess, maybe some of you made it, is that the sun must be just behind here. But that's not the case. This is now the correct way, left to right. And you can determine where the sun should have been in the sky about that time and date because Meier kept track of the time at which he took his photos. This one was a few minutes after 6 o'clock he took it. This was March 29th, 1976 at Hassenbull, Langenberg. And that's a little bit after the vernal equinox. The sun sets a little bit north of west then. Well, fortunately, Wendell Stevens, on one of his investigative trips there, he went and visited all these sites, all 17 sites that Meier had taken his photographs from, figured out exactly where he had stood with his camera, and in this case took some bearings to objects in the distance. And this tree here then was at a bearing, angular bearing of 218 degrees. Well, south is 180, west is 270. So this was southwest or south-southwest that the tree was at. And you know how wide a field of view this Meier's camera had. Turns out to be 45 or 46 degrees from left to right, because you know this was 35 millimeter film he had, and you know the focal length of his camera, which was 42 millimeters. So from that, the left-hand edge is at 209 degrees. The right-hand edge of this photo was at 255 degrees azimuth. Well, the sun was at that time close to setting, had to be over here at 270 degrees. So what we have here is the last rays of the setting sun out where the beam ship was, coming in, hitting something that was reflective, very reflective at the upper edge of the craft, and producing those two golden rays you saw come down towards the camera there. That's consistent with earlier photos, one of which, just a few seconds different time than this was taken, shows no sun at all on it. The craft wasn't at quite the right angle to reflect any rays. And still earlier photos when the craft was a dot in the distance, slowly approaching Meier. And on those you can see the highlight is on the right-hand edge of the craft, indicating the sun was off to the right. So we have no possibility that the sun was here unless possibly Wendell Stevens was off 45 degrees or so and reading his compass, which I don't think he could have misread in a bad way like that. So we can also see that this photo shows the golden rays of the sun best. The reason why those rays are golden is because the sun was very close to setting, as indicated by its time of day, a few minutes after 6. The sun sets around 6:20 at that time of year, that latitude and that longitude. And the air is somewhat smoggy there east of Zurich. So the sun, if you were to look at it just as it sets, closest to the nearest hill, would look quite golden. And so the light coming off the reflected sun's rays would look golden. Now, the fact that the sun actually isn't in the photograph then suggests that the entire foreground was indeed in shade the way it looks. This photograph I have here is sufficiently far removed from the original that its contrast is not very good. The ground wasn't really this dark in the original photo, but yet it looked shaded, as did the tree here and the treetop over there and there. So the actual sun was shining farther away, but in this foreground here, it was blocked by the hills and trees to the right here. So that's another positive, definite reason that this could not have been a model up close to the camera, because the sun wouldn't have even touched the model then. The whole foreground was in shade. If you read Korff's book on this, he won't mention this. In fact, he was fooled into thinking the sun was right behind here. And in his book, he said that Meier purposely pointed his camera at the sun in order to try to make the suspension lines for the model be very difficult to show up in the photo. So he's doubly wrong on that count. There's one more aspect of genuineness to this particular photo, as if 2 or 3 wasn't enough aspects already. And that is that you can see these reflected rays of light here. If that were a model up close to the sun, and the sun was somehow shining through there, there would be only a couple feet of air that you'd be looking at here that the rays were traversing through. And any atmospheric physicist would know you have to have a lot more optical length, they would call it, than that to look through in order to make the air show up visibly that the sun's rays are shining through. Unless you were in a smoke-filled room or on a very foggy day, then you could get the sun's rays to show up in the air over just a short distance like that. But maybe you've seen on ordinary days when you can see where it's mostly cloudy and there's some breaks in the cloud and you can see the sun's rays coming through here and there in the breaks. You can see those rays that show up because they're a couple hundred feet wide or so. So that's another indication that the craft was the distance away from the camera that appears to be, which is, well, the tree was about 150 or so feet, and the craft was another 100 feet on the other side of it. So that as these rays came towards you, they were in 20 or 30 feet or so of air that was still illuminated by those sun's rays, enough with the background of the underside of the craft to show up, which a model could not have done that for. So we have, in this one photograph, we have many, around 3 or 4 strong, independent sources of genuineness. Perhaps you've seen this photo too. I think it was shown on the Monday Night Film Festival. There are 33 of these other photographs when the craft was approaching Meier that he took. And you can look at them under a magnifying glass or a microscope and see that it's exactly the same craft that you saw when it was much closer. And everything is consistent with the, this film series being absolutely genuine. Well, let's go to briefly to another case, the so-called log pile scene, which maybe some of you have seen this one before too. This was at Obersalzberg on March 8, 1975. This one has the distinction of a photograph that was actually analyzed by someone independent of Wendell Stevens' group, their investigative group at that time. Excuse me, I haven't had a cold for a year and managed to pick this week to attack me. This physicist analyzed the copy of the photo that Wendell Stevens gave him to look at and had the courage to come out with an honest report of what he found. And his summary of this, well, this was Neil Davis, the physicist at Design Technology, Poway, California. He says, nothing was found in the examination of the print which could cause me to believe the object in the photo is anything other than a large object photographed a distance from the camera. So it's sort of rare to have any kind of professional come out with a positive statement affirming the reality of a UFO photo, because they're likely to lose their whole reputations if they do that. But this one man had the courage to come out and speak the truth, even though he couched his language rather tactfully there, not to say anything totally positive, but just to make double negatives that indicate it couldn't be a hoax. This same series had about 6 or 7 other photos in it. Here's one of them here. Here's another. This was a good instance in which Wendell Stevens' team could check up on the estimated distance the craft was from the camera by using an edge analysis, counting the pixels at the edge of the craft, because they could pace it off to see just how far away the trees were from the camera and look at how the number of pixels at the edges of branches up close and then farther away in the distance increased with distance, like you expect because of the atmospheric refraction effect of scintillation of the air. There being always 1, 2, 3 degree temperature differences, fluctuations in the air as along your line of sight to anything. And that causes density variations, which causes variations of the index of refraction of the light coming to you, and that causes the light path to waver ever so slightly. And the farther it is away, the little greater the wavering is, and the edge won't look quite as sharp. And so the number of pixels, when they count them under the eye of a microscope can vary from like 5 up close at the edge of an object to as many as 45 in the distance. In this case, the craft continued to move around to the left and then retreated more in the distance. You can see the haze effect come in there too. The top of the craft becomes less and less distinct relative to the surrounding atmosphere. This next series here was the one that Bachto Hornley Unterbachto, March 8, 1976. There are 62 different photos in this series. This one I happen to have, I think in one of them there's as many as 4 objects at a time Meier was allowed to take a picture of. One of them being the regular beam ship, as they called them, and the other 2 or 3 being more remote telemeter craft or something like that they called them. And if you ever try to toss models of something up in the air and photograph them, you'll see how difficult it is to get 3 of them up together at the same time, all horizontal. And if you manage to do that, you would still probably find that the images would be considerably blurred because they'd be rapidly receding away from you while your shutter of the camera made its click. I showed this series because it's one that Cal Korff attempted to debunk. These are just crude copies taken from his book, but here's one where the craft was up here, if you can see the red light. This was Meier's tripod that he had a movie camera with him sometimes, that sometimes he'd have mounted up here. And what Korff did was enlarge this aspect of it up here to this photo down below. Maybe you could raise this photo up a little bit to show the lower half of it here. This line here is not this line you saw up there. That straight line up the top was just on the back page, on the other side of the page when I copied the photo from Korff's book. And after whatever manipulation Korff did here, or after whatever number of different films he looked at, he finally found one with a line along here on it. And he draws your attention to this line and says up here that this is a supportive device that would support a suspension line coming down here to support the model that he thinks it is. Well, this is quite a mistake on Korff's part. I don't know how he thinks the reader is so naive, but notice that this line here curves. It bows upwards, not downwards. So if there were something hanging here, like on a clothesline, the support line would come down like this to that point and then come on up like that. Instead, it curves the other way. Yet the debunker has to hope that the viewer will have the same conclusions in mind that the author of the book does and not worry about little details like this. It is pretty easy to keep mishandling film and before long find some scratches on it, and now and then a scratch will be in about the right place for you to make your comment about it if you want, if you're that kind of an investigator. It's unfortunate there was no good photographic expert around who could look over Korff's shoulder when he did any of his enlargement work, or whoever did it for him. If we could have had a Bruce Maccabee look at it, I think then some people could trust the results a little bit more. Well, I'd like to cover this well-known series here briefly, where Semjassi's craft, Semjassi was the name of the chief contactor at that time, told Meier was the name of herself. And this time she posed her beam ship at different positions relative to this tree. Here you see there's a shadow on this edge of the craft right here where the tree is so close to it that the brightness of the sky, or the clouds, couldn't reflect on that part, couldn't shine on that part. Here she nestled her craft in to the very left-hand side of the tree there. here it is behind the top here. Now, there's several hundreds of these photos that don't have trees up close to the craft, and so I'm not showing you those because you can't really tell for sure, at least to prove to the expert anything as to how far away the craft is, whether it could be a model or not. So that's why I'm concentrating on these cases, usually that have a tree nearby. This is an example of a case where there's just no way you can superpose two negatives and come out with a craft just showing through this way, or to do any double exposure of that type. It was around here on the right-hand side of the craft. And here, I don't know exact sequence of these, but I found this photo fairly interesting because you can see this tree here on the right-hand side is somewhat out of focus, like you would expect, being fairly close to the camera, whereas the craft and the tree it's been setting at different sides of is in very, very good focus, suggesting it's a good deal farther away. Actually, as I think Wendell mentioned in his Monday night film movie, Meier's camera, all during 75 and 76, I guess it was a discarded camera that nobody else wanted because it had a couple of broken parts to it. One of them was the focus. The focus was stuck just one stop short of infinity, meaning it was in pretty good focus for everything maybe farther than 30 or 40 feet away on out to almost a mile or so away. And you can take a branch like this of the tree, if you can estimate by counting the number of small limbs and everything, how long that is. I estimated from there to there was maybe 2 feet of that branch. And then, of course, again, knowing that the film, the original film, is 35 millimeters across there, and the focal length of the camera, you can deduce how far away the tree was, or this branch of the tree was. And it turns out to be 10.5 feet away. So if this were a model, it would have had to have been 20, 30, 40 feet away to really show up this well, in my opinion. And then it could have been no small model that anyone could carry around easily or conceal in one's house or anything. Here is the main shot of the group that shows the trunk of the tree the best. And one thing I did with this photo was to take it to a couple of forestry experts at Oregon State University quite some time ago and asked them, don't worry about what this funny looking object is here, what kind of a tree is it? Well, they had no hesitation saying it was a European silver fir. They called it Abies alba in their technical jargon. And they mentioned that it was a mature Abies alba. They could tell that also by the trunk. The trunk had been shorn of its older lower limbs earlier in its life, either by the person who lived there or by sheep or cattle or deer grazing there, trying to get something to eat in winter. And so you can see all by the irregularity of the tree, just what kind of a tree it is. If you're an expert on this, there was one of the professors, Professor R.K. Herman, had grown up in Western Germany, and to him this tree was very, very familiar. He knew immediately it had to be this kind of a tree. Well, that indicates it could be no model tree. Now the debunker, in this case, has no other alternative than to assume that this must have been a model tree that the model UFO was posing at different sides on. So the whole point is that they don't make model trees that look like any particular subspecies of a tree, particularly in 1975. They don't make model trees with an irregularity in them like up here and with a trunk showing like this. They like to make them in nice conical shapes. One last claim that the debunker Korf made on this case was that this was a model tree that was also used in one of Meier's movie film segments. He had about 7 or 8 occasions when he he ran his movie camera. Those he had spliced all together in one set of movie films, and that's also available from Genesis 3 at Lee and Britt Elder's place here in Arizona. And in one of these film, the craft was circling around the top of the tree. This was a video now. I took this off of their Genesis 3's video. The craft was moving around like this over and over again, quite suspiciously like a model dangling on a string. Well, this does seem to be an occasion where the aliens, or semiosi, purposely provide some deceptive maneuvers to give some deniability to skeptics, because like Don Ware mentioned earlier in his talk Monday, the aliens seem to have to abide by an ethical rule, something like part of the prime directive would give you, that they shouldn't force their reality, their presence, upon skeptics whom it would just drive crazy if they were suddenly forced to believe that aliens are real. So now and then they give some evidence that has some questionable aspects to it, and then the skeptic can latch onto that and say, well, like it must have been a model going around on a string here. Anyhow, this is the tree here that Cal Korff suggested was the same model tree, and it has one point of similarity. There's a gap pretty high up in the tree. It's not quite at the same height, but it's on the left-hand side. So if you don't look into this tree any more than that, you might come to Korff's conclusion. But this tree has a pretty nice long limb out here, another one here. It's a little more peaked at the top. Has another limb coming out here. And it has a little bit more slope to the left-hand side of the tree here. Let's see if we can go back to the other one. Then this tree, which is much more vertical right in here, and doesn't have that long limb coming out here or here. And furthermore has the trunk showing. So this was definitely two different trees, but therefore what is the last recourse that the skeptic has here? It is that this was the famous disappearing tree. A couple of Meier's group members, after Meier got his film back, wanted to go and see where it was. He took those pictures, and they went back here, and they mentioned that the top of the tree, the upper half, or the whole tree, was turning brown. In other words, it was dying. Well, that's not too surprising from us. It knows what would happen if a UFO would get as close to it as this one was nestling in its branches. But a few days later after that, they took these two brought some other people out there to look at this dying tree, and the tree was no longer there. And there was no indication that it had ever existed. The grass wasn't disturbed, there were no wood chips around, no stump or anything, no dirt showing. And so since this is beyond the comprehension of 20th century science, how it could be done, the skeptics can say, well, this has got to mean that it's some sort of a model tree, no matter how different it appears to be, it's got to be, and that's their way out in this case. So nevertheless, if you're interested, you could always get a hold of Volume 1 or Volume 2 of this from Genesis 3. Take it to some forestry expert and find out for yourself that it's a real Abies alba tree that could be no model. If you do that, I would recommend you try to seek out some professor who wouldn't be so anti-UFO that he might just say anything in order to try to debunk the whole thing. You do have to watch out for that. Well, besides these various photos of evidence, there are all the supportive witnesses in the Meier case. On a couple occasions, Wendell Stevens and his Lee and Britt elders got them together at Schmidt-Ruti in Switzerland here, east of Zurich, to videotape them as they gave their testimony of things that happened that proved to them that Meier's experiences were genuine. And here they are on another occasion. when their testimony was taken. Taken from Volume 2, that should be, of UFO Contact from the Pleiades. And if you were to get a hold of Wendell Stevens' 1982 book, The Bible on the Meier Case, unfortunately it's been out of print for many years, you could do like I did and make a list of all the witnesses in the case that saw various things that confirmed to them that Meier's experiences were genuine. And these were the people that were willing to give their names to Wendell Stevens. Now, many years after the fact, maybe some of them wished they hadn't given Wendell their names, but he was able to get them from them. And like Bernadette Brandt, I guess it's Eva Beery, she had a sighting of the beam ship in the daytime sighting. So did 4 others here. And a couple of these witnesses had seen Meier in his trance state, very rapidly typing the conversations that occurred on his contact on the night before, when they could sort of telepathically, technically transmit to his typing hand in tune with the typewriter he was using to allow him to type very fast, word for word, the conversations that he recognized they had gone on the very night before during their contact. I do apologize, there isn't enough time to mention how on his contacts he had to go out on his moped. It was usually at night, and only if nobody else was tailing him. Later on, quite a few people kept trying to tail him to see for themselves. Only if he shook off any tails and got out there did they show up in their craft and either beam Meier aboard or meet with him one place or another and have their contact. And similarly for his daytime photo shots. This, of course, does give another point of deniability to skeptics who think it's just very convenient that only Meier was allowed to meet with this alien Semyasi. But it's very easy also for aliens to have a strategy that will permit their own contactee to be easily debunked, just so that skeptics aren't forced to believe in the reality of it. Because think of how many millions of Americans, scientists, others, who aren't ready for the reality of it all, and if it were suddenly forced on them by evidence too strong, after all, we found about 500 daytime UFO photos that can be very convincing unless you can find a few reasons why you might be allowed to reject the data if you're a negative skeptic. Well, by the mid-1980s, I'd looked already into quite a lot of this evidence, and it had pretty well convinced me of the genuineness of the case, so I wanted to take my own trip to Switzerland and check out a few of the secondary witnesses myself and look at his photograph albums he has that contain all the over 1,000 photos. At least half of them have the beam ships in them. So I went there in 1985. This is Meier's place here. It's a converted barn on a piece of land that one of his group members was able to purchase, and they all chipped in and converted it into a residence for quite a few people to stay at. Here is a picture of some of Meier's children. One of these wasn't Meier's kid here. This was his wife, at least at the time, Calliope. I did get to meet Meier just briefly, and only to shake his hand. I soon learned that he had, for several years already, given up meeting with people, any persons he hadn't actually asked or invited to come to discuss something with, because so many hundreds of people, or thousands over the years, have visited him, especially in the summer, that he just couldn't keep answering the questions all over and over again. He had to allow his support group to do this for him. And I had to be satisfied with just interviewing a couple of secondary witnesses, from which everything, as far as I could tell, was on the up and up and genuine. But you have to realize then that the earliest investigators, Wendell Stevens, Lee and Britt Elders, their data is the precious data in the Meier case, collected in 1977, 78, 79, before any other later ufologists looked into it. Namely, Gary Kinder was another one in the early and mid-1980s. When I was there, one sort of a paranormal experience did happen to me. I'd just like to relate to you. When I first got on the property and parked there and got out, they could see that I had this camera slung around my neck. And one of them told me that they had a rule there. You're only allowed to take 2 photographs. That was it. Well, I didn't care for that very much, but I said, yeah, okay, I'll go along with that. But I wondered, how can they enforce that? It'd be pretty hard to enforce. No one's going to watch my hand every second or anything like that. So I took my first photograph, but immediately realized I had the wrong settings on the camera. That was back in the days when you had to focus, you had to look at your light meter and put the right setting on and get the right time of exposure and everything. So I took a second photograph. It was this one, 1985. And then I went to take a third photograph, which to me was the second photograph that would come out, and push down on the lever on the camera, and just a dull click, nothing happened. So I clicked over and over again, still wouldn't take the picture. Well, that had never happened before with that camera, and when I got back home, I later used up the roll, and the camera worked fine. It hadn't been short of film or anything. At the time, I just subscribed it. Of course, I hadn't retired yet from the university. I was still an active scientist. I just said, well, this is just a coincidence. A strange coincidence that I'll just shrug off. But since then, I've come to realize, well, reading Meier's contact notes, that they did have a craft above his place, always positioned to help ward off assassination attempts or evil attempts from certain other ETs, perhaps, that could have done this remotely. And I learned from other UFO cases that there's plenty of examples where your camera may just suddenly turn on by itself, or it's even easier to have a camera be turned off, I guess. Or they can do action at a distance in affecting some of the controls within an aircraft that may be chasing a UFO, that sort of thing. So in hindsight now, I do think this was a paranormal experience that did allow them to control or prevent me from taking that third photograph. So let me get back to the other aspect of the Meier case, this Talmud of Jmmanuel document, now that we've gone over some of Meier's photos. I think it's no accident that Meier was selected out to be a unique contactee that has an order of magnitude or 2 more high-quality photographs than any other contactee was taken. It wasn't just to prove to those who could accept it that ETs are real or aliens are real and their craft are around. I think another reason was to provide evidence that would make this Talmud of Jmmanuel document become known to interested persons. So let me try to briefly go over some of the Talmud of Jmmanuel's background. This starts out a little bit late, but it was 1963 that Meier happened to be traveling through the Mid-East under the tutelage of another ET at that time. Her name was Ascot. And he had known, or his family had known, an ex-priest who lived in Jerusalem by the name of Isa Rashid. And this Rashid was an unknowing mental telepathic contactee of the Pleiadians. That is, they evidently injected ideas into his head from time to time. This is what we learn, at least from Meier's contact notes. And he wouldn't know if it's his own ideas or not, but he would get promptings to do this or that. One of his promptings was to learn about the ancient Aramaic alphabet in their language, so he would be able to start reading any old document written in ancient Aramaic. The Aramaic lettering has changed quite a lot over the last 1900 years. anyhow, he was prompted also on a particular time in 1963 when Meier was there to go out to this particular place, this tomb site at night, and bring Meier with him and dig up some valuable object. I suspect that Meier did most of the digging. He had both arms at that time. It was a couple of years later that he lost his left arm. And they came out with this package of something contained within a encasement of rosin. And inside the rosin encasement were the Talmud of Jmmanuel scrolls. So this ex-priest began translating them into Meier's language, which is German, in northern Switzerland. And they immediately found out that they could tell the whole document was very heretical to Christianity and also to Judaism. Well, just as a sample, he wasn't called Jesus at that time, he was called Emmanuel. The reason the name is written with a J is sort of a long story I don't think I have time to go into here, but we just pronounce it Emmanuel as if it were spelled with an I or an E. So that itself is pretty heretical. It turns out that St. Paul is the only one who could have affected this change, because many people started writing about the man called Jesus in decades shortly following Paul's time in the mid-50s of the first century. So Meier had to continue at that time, after they discovered the Talmud of Jmmanuel, working his way around the Mideast to earn a living, to stay alive, and he eventually worked his way around to Greece, met his wife-to-be, Calliope, there, eloped with her, and soon took her back to Switzerland to raise a family there. In the meantime, Rashid continued his secret translation project in Jerusalem until at some stage in the early 1970s, during which Meier didn't hear from him at all, he got this letter from Rashid saying that he had been persecuted there. His secret project had been discovered. He had had to flee from Jerusalem. He fled to Lebanon, just to the north. He fled to a refugee camp there. And at that point, he was almost killed in a raid upon the refugee camp where he was staying. And this raid wiped out the Talmud of Jmmanuel scrolls. He didn't have time to get them out of their hiding place when he fled to escape all the fires that were going on there because of the air raid. He fled to Baghdad, but he was assassinated there later in 1976, according to what Meier learned from one of his contacts with Semyonsi. Anyhow, Meier hung on to these translations that Rashid had sent him, because he had translated a good deal of the Talmud of Jmmanuel before the original scrolls were destroyed. And then in the mid-70s, of course, Meier started having his contacts from the Pleiadians, and on the very first contact, Semyonsi told him this was a most valuable document. He should have it published and distributed to interested persons, which he proceeded to do in 1978. Then the German version of it came out. I learned about the Talmud of Jmmanuel in about 1984 when I got a hold of a crude German translation of it that had been made by someone in Switzerland or Germany, and George Green had obtained it and made some copies of it to distribute, and I was fortunate enough to be on his distribution list. But he made quite a lot of mistakes in the translation to the English, and Meier found out about this and proceeded to request that he stop all distribution immediately, which George Green did honor that request, and only a few copies were handed out. But as bad as the English translation was, it was good enough so you could certainly get the whole gist of what the Talmud of Jmmanuel was about, which then prompted me to ask for the German version, and I could start translating that myself to see where the mistakes were in the 1984 English version. So it wasn't until 1992 that Wildfire Press came out with their English version that, along with the German, that Meier sanctioned. Although after he got a hold of it, he learned that there were still a lot of mistakes in the English. So he's happy that a 1996 version of the Talmud of Jmmanuel has come out where the English is much closer to being correct. By the way, this Talmud of Jmmanuel, I have some flyers on it up on the 3rd floor, my table up there in the bookstore, book room. And it's something anyone who is interested in this could look into for themselves. It's probably the Talmud of Jmmanuel's biggest heresy for Christianity is that Jmmanuel survived the crucifixion. So he didn't die to save mankind from their sins after all. He lived on and traveled around, which agrees with why there are these various, or dozen or so, traditions, many of them preserved by the Muslims who aren't upset by knowing that Jesus survived the crucifixion. So these ancient traditions were, many of them preserved by Muslim historians. So it explains a lot. Back in the mid-'80s, I'd been raised a Presbyterian, sort of a nominal Presbyterian, and didn't think too much about my faith. I got in the Navy and was pretty far away from it. Got out and got married a Lutheran girl. And at that time, then I joined the Lutheran church and went to church every Sunday, sang in the choir with her, and listened to the pastor give some discussions from the Gospels each Sunday. Recited their creeds with them. Didn't think really too much about it, except I was a little bit uncomfortable in the concept of the Trinity and the Holy Ghost and resurrection and Jesus dying to save mankind from their sins. But after all, everyone around me in the society seemed to believe the same way, or a lot of people I knew did, and others and pastors certainly knew a lot about it, more about it than I did, and the belief had been going back for centuries, so who was I to question any of it? But after the Talmud of Jmmanuel came out, I realized that this looks like the true story, and all these things I'd been vaguely uneasy about were all explained in pretty rational ways. Yet it's explained in a natural way that doesn't in any way look like a literary hoax. It says all kinds of things. I have a whole book about it because you can't begin to cover it without writing it in a book. My book is called Celestial Teachings. I have a flyer of that too. There's just no other way than to try to read it for yourself if you're interested. I mean, it does mention his survival of the crucifixion. Mentions, well, I'll get into some of the things it does mention in a little bit here. But first I want to talk about this letter a bit more that Rashid sent Meier in 1974, because debunkers, don't worry if you can't read the print, only Michael Hazeman can read it. It's in German, and it's pretty small anyhow. This is where he told Meier that he had been found out and had to flee Jerusalem and went to Lebanon. And the debunkers say that, well, this is something that Meier just made up. He made up this guy who was named Rashid, made up this letter, and so on and so forth. And one particular professor, debunker in Switzerland, was observant enough to notice that the typeface on this letter was the same typeface as Meier had used on his 1975 and 1976 contact notes that were written in German. And so the conclusion he jumped to was that it was typed on the same typewriter. And Cal Korff was happy to take that conclusion and repeat it over again in his book without ever checking it out for himself. If you check it out for yourself, you'll find that, well, yes, it was the same typeface. There aren't perhaps too many different typefaces that have a sort of a European or Swiss-German type of type on it that you can use. But the capital F, for example, in Rashid's letter here always falls too low on the line, but that never happens in the contact notes. In the contact notes, the little W falls slightly below all the other level of the letters, but that doesn't happen in Rashid's letter. And in Rashid's letter here, the U and the R sometimes jammed up close together like in the old typewriters would do. 3 times out of 7 that happened, but it never happened out of 70 times or so that I could observe the UR combination on the contact notes. So it's obvious that this was typed on a different typewriter and they came to a false conclusion because that was the conclusion they wanted to come to. The other part about this letter that interested me the most was a statement in here that although the Israelis put out a communique or in their news services the next day or two after the raids that flushed them out, saying that they were bombing to try to get rid of Palestinian guerrillas, he didn't think that was the case at all, but that they were after him and his Talmud of Jmmanuel scrolls. I thought I would try to look into the possible historicity of this and see if that's at all a logical conclusion to come to, because you might just otherwise attribute it to paranoia or think that Meier would have made it all up. If we look at a calendar of Israeli events going on in 1974, we'll start from the later date first. You find that it was September 19th that Meier received Rashid's letter. It was on the 14th that he wrote it. And so we look for events that involved Israeli bombardments of Lebanon, of refugee camps, because that's what he says, he was in a refugee camp there. So that rules out these military maneuvers in the Golan Heights, and there was a bombing raid on a tent encampment, but this place, I soon learned, was not a refugee camp. And there was a commando raid in July that the Israelis made on some Lebanon cities. We have to go back to June 18th to 20th, and we find that Israel attacked at least 5 refugee camps in Lebanon at those times. There were heavy civilian casualties. Well, is there anything suspicious about that? There was all kinds of raiding going on, as you can see here. There would be some sort of a Palestinian guerrilla raid that would be in retaliation of something that happened a week or two before, and then there'd be the Israeli response, usually the next day or so. Well, in this case, the provocation was back on June 13th, and the response didn't come until June 18th, which was somewhat suspicious. And in this provocation, 3 Israeli women were killed in a gun battle against 4 Arab terrorists, but all the 4 terrorists were killed. Would that be enough provocation to cause them to bomb the refugee camps and end up killing as many as 70 civilians and wounding another 70 more? Well, according to the, here's a little map just showing that the refugee camps in question are these little X's right here in southern Lebanon. This is Israel down here. Here's Lebanon. Here's Syria. Jordan over here. According to the Washington Post, June 24th, contrary to published speculation, the highest officials of the U.S. government were both astonished and outraged by the overkill of Israel's revenge last week against Palestinian bases. And of course, this was against refugee camps too, where these are for the Palestinian refugees that could no longer live within Israel, and not for Arab guerrillas or Palestinian guerrillas. And Senator Aburesk of South Dakota, about the same date, made his plea, his statement in the Congressional Record that he said, "I am extremely saddened to note that the government of Israel has seen fit to conduct daily bombing raids on civilians in southern Lebanon, in the farming areas, and indeed in the refugee camps, where the military communiques which emanate from Israel say that the bombing raids are designed to kill suspected terrorists." So he's sort of implying there that there was so much massive killing of civilians in these refugee camps that it didn't appear like they were actually, in their raids, trying just to kill suspected terrorists. So this is, I think, rather suspicious occurrences that were occurring then that tend to support Issa Rashid. But look what happened during this 1 week. President Nixon did visit the Mideast. That could be used as an excuse for their delaying their retaliatory response. And this is what was stated in the New York Times, quoting the Israeli Minister of Information, Aharon Yariv. It says that he acknowledged yesterday that President Nixon's presence in the Mideast might have been a factor in Israel's reluctance to strike back as usual. Might have been a reason why they didn't strike back immediately, but waited 5 or 6 days. This Yariv, by the way, was a former Israeli chief of intelligence. Well, the embarrassing aspect about that is that it's extremely embarrassing, you would think, to a country to have to admit that they held back the raids on a neighboring country just because the president of the nation that provided them with their military support and a lot of their funding had been visiting the Mideast during that week. To say that just the very instant he got on the plane, then they would suddenly bomb this neighboring country and then start bombing the heck out of them. It didn't seem like this would be anything that a Minister of Information would want to promote, unless there was something much more sinister behind it that they were trying to cover up, namely the destruction of the Talmud of Jmmanuel scrolls, which they couldn't dare ever mention out loud or try to allow hardly anyone to know about it. And a couple days later, the New York Times came out with this statement: the intensive Israeli airstrikes into Lebanon today were carried out in accordance with a new policy of vigorous preemptive attacks against the Palestinian guerrilla organizations, government sources said. So here it looks like there was a different explanation put forth, as if the first one, President Nixon's visit, was not a good enough explanation. Instead, the explanation now is that they're going to conduct preemptive strikes. So in retrospect, it looks like there's plenty of reason why Issa Rashid could have been correct in his statement that they were after him, not Arab guerrillas, in conducting these raids. Why did they bomb so many refugee camps instead of just the one he was at? Perhaps because they wouldn't be able to have a good explanation of why they would pick on just one refugee camp, maybe one that was farther to the north, and not be trying to root out guerrillas at other refugee camps. Or perhaps they weren't certain which refugee camp it was. We don't know about the Israeli intelligence or anything about how they got word that Rashid was in a refugee camp. So this has to remain a lot speculation, obviously. Nothing can be proven here, but it's just highly suggestive that Rashid's statement could have been true and that this all could have happened, just as Meier insists from the letter he received from Rashid. Let's get into a little bit about the content of the Talmud of Jmmanuel. There are at least 5 different categories, I think, that support the reality of the Talmud of Jmmanuel, even though we don't have the originals. You see, without the originals, scholars would have nothing to do with it, because if it's heretical in more than one way, then any excuse, as like saying the originals weren't there, that they could radiocarbon date or look at the handwriting of, is definite excuse not to study it and just to ignore it. So all we can go by is the evidence of the Talmud of Jmmanuel itself, its German translation or its English translation. Well, it has realistic solutions to very major New Testament problems that have bothered scholars for a long time. There's several of them I've mentioned up here, like the Immaculate Conception. Well, in the Talmud of Jmmanuel, his father is an alien, a Pleiadian. He was given the name Gabriel. And to many of us, that isn't too surprising that someone could have an alien father and still come out looking human. There's been a problem about Jesus' year of birth that the Talmud of Jmmanuel solves in a completely novel way that scholars haven't yet thought of. It can't be made interested in, actually, because they haven't yet thought of it themselves. there's this question of how could Jesus be identified as a prophesied Messiah in the book of Isaiah, where it was said a baby by the name of Emmanuel would be born to a virgin. That's all you have to go by to verify the prophecy. Well, anyone can say that it was a virgin birth, that there was no husband around. There's no proof of that ever. All you have left to go by is the name, and if the name wasn't even Emmanuel, there's nothing left. So it does indeed appear that the name had been Emmanuel, but these Gospels, where you read that his name was Jesus, weren't written until decades after Paul's time. And if Paul had changed his name from Emmanuel to Jesus to fit a little bit more to his theology that Jesus in the form of God or the Son of God came to save mankind from their sins, well then the word Joshua or Yeshua or God saves is what most scholars think it means, would be an appropriate name for Paul to have used on him. Of course, Paul didn't mind changing his own name from Saul to Paul. Well, I don't really have time to go into all these. I'm going to be bumped off pretty soon here. About the writer and the priority of the Synoptic Gospels, you find out that Mark wasn't the first Gospel, but that it was Matthew after all, as has been stated by the earlier church fathers. It's implied in the testimony of a Bishop Papias in the mid-2nd century. That's the earliest you can get. Then slightly later you find Irenaeus, and then Origen, and then Augustine all said that Matthew came first, and then Mark was an abbreviation of it, and then Luke. But along about the 19th century, scholars found that there were too many embarrassments with having Matthew come first. Really, I mean, why would the writer of Mark cut out so much from Matthew and left out the Sermon on the Mount and some of the parables and so on? So they switched around to the theory that Mark was first, and then they could say that the writer of Matthew added to Mark, and that was much more acceptable theologically. And they've settled for that ever since, even though these 19th century scholars that convinced them to finally turn it around and have Mark be first, their views were dominated by theological commitment to their belief systems. The betrayal by Judas makes sense as to what happened in the Talmud of Jmmanuel. It was a different Judas, a Pharisee. He had about the same name, and so it became convenient to blame it on Judas by the chief priests in the area and to perpetuate that rumor within their synagogues, because then people would not want to believe Emmanuel's teachings if one of his own disciples had betrayed him. Emmanuel's appearances to his disciples after his entombment, well, that makes sense if he was in his physical body after he rose from the tomb and hadn't quite died after all. His wounds would be partially or mostly healed, I guess. I personally still think it was a minor or major miracle that he could survive and within 3 or 4 days present himself to his disciples. But that's still far different than a resurrection, which has never ever been confirmed in history. Saul's conversion is well described in the Talmud of Jmmanuel in a novel way. As a hint to it, I can say if you were to go back to the book of Acts and look in chapter 9 and read about the road of Damascus experience there that Paul had, you'll notice that the men with Paul heard the voice calling out to him along with Paul, along with Saul, that is. And so it could have been no internal vision that Saul had. Turns out that Damascus is the first place that Emmanuel fled to or went to after he survived the crucifixion and stayed there incognito for a couple of years, according to what we can glean from the Talmud of Jmmanuel. Then, as I mentioned, there's these traditions of Emmanuel having traveled to India. If I try to summarize where it was that the traditions have in being, there's not only Damascus, then there's Nisibis here in what is now central southern Turkey, on to Ephesus, and back along this Silk Road route to a couple places west of and east of the Euphrates. And it's a very good set of traditions here at Herat in northwestern Afghanistan that you can read about in the available literature. A lot of this is in unavailable literature that's in only available to certain private libraries written in Islamic or Arabic language. And on to, there is a Mary's tomb here in eastern Pakistan. Evidently, she didn't make it that far. She accompanied Emmanuel along with Judas Thomas. Judas Thomas, by the way, turns out to be brother of Emmanuel, or Jesus, called Thomas, presumably one of his four brothers whose name was Judas. And as to why he was called Thomas, which means twin, isn't given in the Talmud of Jmmanuel. Perhaps two of these brothers were twins, or perhaps he looked like someone else and was called a twin. In Kashmir, in Srinagar, that's where his tomb is. He's apparently lived a long life there. And there's a tradition from northern India that got into the Hindu literature. That's in the document called the, what is it? The Bhavishya Mahapurana. You can find a lot of this in Holger Kirsten's book called Jesus Lived in India, and another one by an Ahmadiyyan scholar. The Ahmadiyyas are a branch of Islam that sort of split off from Islam. They still think of themselves as Muslims, but the rest of Islam doesn't want them to be part of their religion. Then there's an inscription down here that reads as if it was a more spiritual saying of Emmanuel or Jesus, and yet it's identified as Jesus. So it apparently was associated with his having been there. The Talmud of Jmmanuel only has a couple sentences indicating that in his youth he had been to India. So he'd learned the language there earlier in his youth. It's about a 2-year trek there, a couple of years back. This explains those lost years, of course. So there's another book on that that you probably heard of by Elizabeth Clare Prophet that actually is a very good book. Gives a lot of good unbiased evidence. The UFO-like events in the Talmud of Jmmanuel read quite realistically. I don't have time here to go over them, but the Star of Bethlehem, for example, was the bright light with a long tail. And you'll find that they do read quite naturally and realistically. It's quite obvious that the Star of Bethlehem could have been no star or no supernova or comet or conjunction of planets, because they all just continue to apparently drift across the sky from east to west as the Earth rotates, and certainly can't point out a particular spot within a particular city where there'd be an infant being born. Just no way whatsoever. But a UFO hovering over a particular place, maybe with a long tail of light coming down, obviously would attract much attention to it. Then there's a whole series of scholars' criticisms of the Gospel of Matthew that I've looked into. This is the main thing that my book called Celestial Teachings is looked at. And this one gospel has, this one study by a scholar named Francis Beer, he has some 193 criticisms of the Gospel of Matthew based upon where it looks illogical, or writings that are out of place, sentences out of place, or verses taken from the Old Testament, from Exodus or Deuteronomy or Jeremiah or the Psalms, that were just placed upon Jesus' lips. All that they've criticized, and yet the Talmud of Jmmanuel has a lot of parallel verses to this, because it looks like the Gospel of Matthew came from the Talmud of Jmmanuel, and yet these are all instances where the Talmud of Jmmanuel doesn't suffer from the scholar's criticism. And I found another 44 of those by these particular scholars that Francis Beer, this scholar, had missed. And in hindsight, I could find another 60 or so criticisms of Matthew that the scholars missed totally because they didn't have the Talmud of Jmmanuel to help them. Finally, there are these category of Aramaisms. In 15 cases in the Talmud of Jmmanuel, you can find where the German language is sort of awkward. Awkward because it had come from a too literal a translation of the Aramaic. The Aramaic, for example, they couldn't express comparisons the same way we do in modern languages. It didn't have the word than, and so they had to use an awkward way of saying it. And fortunately, in the German version of the Talmud of Jmmanuel, some of these were preserved. And by that, we can pretty well tell that the underlying document it had come from was Aramaic. So with just this brief introduction to the Talmud of Jmmanuel, I'm sorry I don't have time to go into it more. I think the internal evidence is just overwhelmingly in favor of it being genuine, and the Gospel of Matthew being gospel that was made from it. You see, it appears that the Emmanuel in India, his whole life story continued to be written by this one disciple who wrote the Talmud of Emmanuel until he died. And then Emmanuel's oldest son took over the writing of the Talmud of Jmmanuel. This is what Isa Rashid, the translator, found out by reading ahead towards the end of the Talmud of Jmmanuel and telling that much to Meier before he was killed. And then this eldest son of Emmanuel, you can see he got married to an Indian girl in Kashmir. This eldest son was given the duty of taking the Talmud of Jmmanuel scrolls, at least one copy of it, one transcription of it, back, or take a couple transcriptions back to the Palestinian area. And one of these copies he had encased in rosin and buried it in this tomb site in Jerusalem, or very close to southern Jerusalem. And that wasn't discovered for all these centuries until 1963, till the Pleiadians wanted it to be discovered when they felt the time was ripe. And then the other copy was circulated around, evidently, and ended up in the hands of the man who wrote the Gospel of Matthew in the early 2nd century, not late 1st century, which is what scholars think. Scholars are always pulled into trying to make the Gospels be dated as early as possible because of the conservative scholars that want it to be that way. So all in all, the Talmud of Jmmanuel has all these points of support for it internally as being genuine, and so I think they help support Meier's experiences. And of course, the other way around, Meier's photographs, I think, help support the genuineness of the Talmud of Jmmanuel. Well, let me stop with that, and we can entertain questions for a few minutes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, sir. I was wondering, in regard to the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, where they mention where Jesus' children, along with Mary,
Magdalene?
yes, had gone to France to live out the rest of their lives.
Well, that's another possibility that the Talmud of Jmmanuel says didn't happen.
Okay.
That was a false supposition that someone made out of the Gospel of John, probably, to assume that had happened.
They had also had several archaeological records that they had gotten a hold of through not only leaks at several different places throughout the Catholic Church and several churches throughout Europe.
Well, it's possible that Joseph of Arimathea, whom we just lose track of in the Talmud of Jmmanuel, the same way we lose track of him in the Gospels, he might have gone on possibly to go to England or somewhere where some of these traditions have this happening. But the Talmud of Jmmanuel would indicate that any marriage to Mary Magdalene didn't occur. So it all depends upon what you think, what evidence you decide for yourself is the most realistic.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I got an interesting point to make. Everybody's heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and with all the recent information coming out, there are a lot of heresies there. Do you see any connection or similarities between the so-called heresies and the Dead Sea Scrolls concerning or so-called conservative or the established Christianity as compared to the heresies that appear in the Talmud of Jmmanuel?
Well, there isn't much connection. There may be the possibility that Emmanuel, Jesus, was the so-called teacher of righteousness that the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about. There's been all kinds of speculation about that. Some even think that Jesus was a wicked priest instead. There's been all kinds of speculation. But if you read the Talmud of Jmmanuel, it seems that Emmanuel didn't want to have much to do with the Essenes. He did have one encounter with them and was afraid he would be sort of entrapped by them and forced to stay there, and shortly afterwards they fled on to a caravan and continued on their way to the east. That is, he was identified in Ephesus, I guess it was, and almost had to stay there under the Essene authorities against his will if he hadn't have fled. So it indicates that Emmanuel's lifestyle seemed to have been quite different than from Essenes. I mean, the Essenes did seem to be a rather secretive organization. We know so little about them. But Emmanuel was quite different, speaking out, doing his preaching, teaching, even though it led him to be crucified, which he managed to survive. He knew he would survive, and therefore it wasn't in any sense suicide to him. But I'm getting off the point here. So, yeah, there isn't much connection that the Talmud of Jmmanuel would say is between Jesus and the Essenes, even though I've read a lot of channeled documents, plenty of them. The Dolores Canon has some that would indicate that Jesus had close connections with the Essenes. The way I see it, that wasn't the case, and that you just can't trust a lot of channelings. I read 10 or 12 supposed ministries of Jesus that you get through channeling and other means, and none of them can come anywhere close to the Talmud of Jmmanuel and its realism and its tie-in with the historical data. But again, you'd probably have to check this out for yourself.
Two quick questions. Was there ever a copy made of the original Amoré version?
Not that we know of. No, just no original Aramaic with which to help prove Meier's case.
So the original sources that exist today is the German version, then?
That's the earliest version we have, yes.
Okay. On the subject of Meier's photos, were the negatives ever preserved through a high-resolution digital scan for analysis and preservation, anything like that? Or are they continuing to be scratched up in the bottom of a dirty drawer?
They're still being scratched up somewhere in Meier's possession. However, the one generation print higher than that Wendell Stevens was able to obtain of these 40 or 50 photographs, he subjected at least one of them to a high-density digital scanning, and this print that he made then actually, after they digitized it and enhanced it and made it look like a very clear ship standing out against the mountain background, it looked quite different after it was enhanced. No longer did you have that haze effect, and this particular photo has been taken by QFOS members, presented around in past meetings, UFO meetings, and labeled as a giant hoax because it looks like there's no longer any haze effect. I think there's very criminal action taken there. But as far as I know, only that one photo was really enhanced in that way, just by Jim Dilatoso and Wendell Stevens' group.
I just want to say briefly, I think Celestial Teachings is a wonderful book, and I'm really impressed by it. And I thought I'd mention that I've given away several copies of Celestial Teachings to biblical, well, people I know who are ministers and so forth like that, and who are knowledgeable, and they have all been very upset by it, and they have been very threatened by it. And the things mentioning about the Pleiadians, about extraterrestrials, and about reincarnation, and Jesus being in India, and respecting other religions and so on. And the thing I'd ask about briefly, that in the material, in some material I've heard, there's the statement made that Isa Rashid took the Talmud of Jmmanuel at one point to the British Museum in England, and that they photographed it in its entirety, but then they didn't want it, they kept it a secret. Have you heard anything about that?
I've heard that rumor, and I've checked with Switzerland, according to as close to Meyer as you can get, as I can get, which is to some secretary or other, and she denies the whole thing about it being in any British museum. Thanks, by the way, for having read the Celestial Teachings and made it known to some others. But Was there another aspect of your question I've forgotten now?
No, that's all. I just was asking about the British Museum. But as far as you know, that the Talmud of Jmmanuel the scrolls being burned in the refugee camp in the fire, you don't know of any other copy of it in its entirety?
Oh, no, no other original that we know of. Some people keep thinking that Meier has certain evidence of some sort or other that would support some of this that he's just withholding until the proper time, but nobody knows. How much more time? Are we about out? No. Okay, gone over time, sorry.
Just a point of information. I had viewed another video, and it had mentioned the missing tree and the Palladians, and apparently what they had said concerning the Meier case was that the Palladians had taken compassion on the tree that had been destroyed, had gone back in time and space, and had taken it as a seedling and transferred it to another location and planted it.
Well, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, that's about what Meier was told. We just don't know what kind of technology could do that, but we shouldn't feel ashamed at not knowing what technology that could be 10, 20, 50, 100 centuries ahead of ours in science could do. So it could very well have done that one way or another. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.